He was left to freeze to death. What he built from bacteria shocked the world. Dr. Marcus Webb wasn't supposed to die alone in the Arctic. He was supposed to be home by Christmas, presenting his findings on permafrost bacteria to a room full of colleagues who'd spent the last 3 years dismissing his work as fringe science. Instead, he was watching the only helicopter for 200 miles disappear over the ice ridge, its rotors fading to silence, leaving nothing but wind and the kind of cold that turned breath to ice before it left your lungs. "They're not coming back," he said aloud, though no one was there to hear him. His voice cracked, not from emotion, but from the dry air that had already begun stealing moisture from his throat. The research station behind him, Station 7, they called it, though there had never been a Station 6, was supposed to house a team of 4 for 6 months. Now it would house one man for however long it took the cold to kill him. 3 days, maybe 4 if he was careful. The others had left in the middle of the night. No warning, no explanation. Just gone. And they'd taken the satellite phone, the emergency beacon, and most of the food. What they hadn't taken was the truth. What they didn't know he knew. Marcus stood in the empty common room, staring at the open supply lockers. They'd been methodical, he'd give them that. Took the freeze-dried meals, the medical kit, the flare gun. Left him with a half-empty box of protein bars, 3 cans of soup, and a bag of coffee grounds that had been sitting open so long they smelled like cardboard. But they'd also left something else. Something they didn't even know existed. He walked to the corner of the room, knelt beside the heating vent, and pried off the grate with his multi-tool. Inside, wrapped in waterproof fabric, was a USB drive and a leather journal. His real research. The findings he'd hidden from his team because he'd known, somehow, he'd known, that Dr. Peterson was reporting everything back to the mining company that funded the expedition. And now he understood why they'd left him. The bacteria he discovered wasn't just surviving in the permafrost. It was thriving, and it produced a byproduct that could break down plastic waste at temperatures well below freezing. If this got out, if the world knew what was buried beneath the Arctic ice, it would change everything. Environmental policy, waste management, the entire fossil fuel economy. Billions of dollars would shift overnight. Peterson had tried to steal his samples 2 weeks ago. Marcus had caught him, confronted him, and Peterson had smiled, and said, "You're too idealistic, Marcus. No one's going to let you publish this." He should have left then. Should have called for an extraction, demanded a seat on the next supply flight. But he'd stayed, believing the science mattered more than politics, more than money. Now he was paying for that belief with his life. The first night alone. The temperature inside the station dropped to -15 °C after sunset. Outside, it was -40. The heating system ran on a diesel generator that had maybe 48 hours of fuel left, and after that, the building would become a tomb. Marcus sat at the research desk, wrapped in every piece of clothing he owned, and opened his journal. He'd kept meticulous notes, not just on the bacteria, but on everything. Daily temperatures, wind patterns, ice density, the behavior of the solar panels, the quirks of the water filtration system. His colleagues thought he was obsessive. They'd mocked him for it, called him the librarian behind his back. But now, those notes might be the only thing keeping him alive. He studied the station layout he'd sketched months ago. The building was modular, designed to be assembled and disassembled in sections. The walls were insulated polymer panels, the roof a double-layer membrane filled with aerogel. Efficient, lightweight, and completely dependent on the generator for heat. But there was something else. Something he'd noticed during installation that the engineers had brushed off when he'd mentioned it. The walls weren't just insulated, they were conductive. The polymer panels had a thin layer of carbon fiber embedded in them, originally intended for structural support. But carbon fiber conducted electricity. And if he could figure out how to heat those panels directly, even just a little, he could create a passive heating system that didn't rely on the generator. It was a long shot, a desperate, half-formed idea that probably wouldn't work. But it was better than sitting still and waiting to freeze. The discovery in the wreckage. The next morning, Marcus forced himself outside. The wind hit him like a fist, and within seconds, his exposed cheeks burned with cold. He pulled his scarf tighter and trudged toward the equipment shed, a small structure 50 meters from the main station. Inside, among the abandoned tools and spare parts, he found what he was looking for, a damaged solar panel array. It had been torn off the roof during a storm 2 months ago, deemed too broken to repair, and left to rot in the shed. But Marcus didn't need it to generate power. He needed it to generate heat. Solar panels worked by absorbing light and converting it to electricity. But they also absorbed heat, lots of it. On a sunny day, a panel could reach temperatures well above freezing, even in Arctic conditions. If he could position these panels correctly, angle them toward the low winter sun, and connect them to the carbon fiber in the walls, he might be able to create a makeshift radiator system. It wasn't elegant. It probably violated a dozen safety regulations, but it might work. He dragged 3 panels back to the station, his muscles screaming, his lungs burning. By the time he got them inside, his fingers were numb, his vision blurred. He collapsed on the floor, gasping, and for a moment, he let himself believe he was going to die right there, sprawled across the cold floor like some failed explorer from a century ago. But then he looked at the panels, looked at the walls, looked at the journal still open on his desk, and he got back up. The first test. By nightfall, Marcus had rigged the first panel to the wall using stripped electrical wire, thermal paste scavenged from old equipment, and sheer stubbornness. He angled it toward the southern window, where the pale Arctic sun would hit it for a few precious hours each day. He didn't expect miracles. He just needed proof of concept. The generator rumbled in the background, burning through fuel he couldn't replace. He turned the thermostat down to 10 Celsius, just above freezing, and waited. 3 hours later, he pressed his hand against the wall near the panel. It was warm, not hot, not even truly comfortable, but warmer than it should have been, warmer than the rest of the station. Marcus laughed, a short, bitter sound that echoed in the empty room. They left the wrong man to die, he whispered. What he didn't see coming. That night, as he lay in his sleeping bag, rationing his last protein bar, Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze. A crack, sharp and violent, like a gunshot. He sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed his flashlight. The beam swept across the room, catching nothing but shadows and frost. Then he heard it again, closer this time. The ice beneath the station was shifting, and that's when he realized the mining company hadn't just abandoned him to the cold. They'd left him on a section of ice that was already fracturing. The station was sinking, and he had less than a week before it broke through completely. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every few minutes, another crack echoed through the darkness, sometimes distant, sometimes so close it vibrated through the floor. He pressed his ear against the metal support beam in the corner of his sleeping quarters and listened to the ice beneath the station groaning like a living thing in pain. By dawn, he'd made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone else. He wasn't going to try to escape the ice. He was going to use it. The station sat on a shelf of permafrost roughly 4 meters thick, anchored by steel pylons that had been drilled deep when the facility was installed 8 months ago. But the permafrost wasn't as permanent as its name suggested. Climate shifts, underground water flow, and geothermal venting had created weak points, fractures that were now spreading beneath him like cracks in old glass. Most men would panic. Most men would gather whatever supplies they could carry and start walking, hoping to reach the coastal research outpost 80 kilometers south before the cold or the polar bears got them. Marcus wasn't most men. He was a scientist who'd spent his entire career being underestimated, overlooked, and told his ideas were too unconventional. And he'd learned something important from all those years of rejection. Conventional thinking didn't solve impossible problems. The bacterial solution no one expected. He returned to his hidden research, spreading his notes across the lab table with hands that still trembled from cold and adrenaline. The bacteria samples were stored in a cryo-freezer running on backup power, one of the few systems still functioning properly. He'd collected them from permafrost cores at various depths, each sample representing thousands of years of evolutionary adaptation to extreme cold. But there was one sample that had always puzzled him. Sample 7 Delta. It came from the deepest core, nearly 30 meters down, from a layer of ice that predated human civilization. Unlike the others, 7 Delta didn't just survive freezing temperatures. It generated heat as a metabolic byproduct. Not much heat, just a few degrees. But in his current situation, a few degrees might mean the difference between life and death. The bacteria broke down organic compounds and produced an exothermic reaction, It released energy as warmth. In nature, this probably helped it create tiny pockets of liquid water in the ice, allowing it to metabolize and reproduce. But Marcus had never tested it at scale. The ethical implications, the environmental risks, the potential for uncontrolled spread, all of it had kept him cautious. Now, caution was a luxury he couldn't afford. Building the impossible bioreactor, Marcus spent the next 2 days transforming the station's water filtration tank into a makeshift bioreactor. He drained the system, leaving just enough clean water for drinking, and filled the 40-liter tank with a mixture of melted snow, dissolved nutrient paste from the lab supplies, and organic matter he scraped from the compost bin in the greenhouse module. Then he introduced sample 7 Delta. The theory was simple. If he could get the bacteria to colonize the tank and begin metabolizing the organic slurry, they'd generate enough heat to warm the water. He could then pump that water through the existing pipes in the walls, creating a biological heating system that required no fuel, no electricity, just bacteria doing what they'd been doing for millennia. The reality was far more complicated. Temperature control was critical. Too cold, and the bacteria would go dormant. Too hot, and they'd die. He had no thermostat, no automated controls, just his own observations and a mercury thermometer he checked every 30 minutes. He slept in 90-minute intervals, setting an alarm made from a wind-up kitchen timer duct taped to a metal bowl. Every time it rang, he'd stumble to the lab, check the temperature, adjust the mixture, and add more nutrients if needed. On the 3rd day, he pressed his hand against the outside of the tank and felt it. A gentle, unmistakable warmth spreading through the metal. The bacteria were working. The visitor in the storm. On the 5th night, in the middle of a blizzard that reduced visibility to 0 and dropped the outside temperature to -52 Celsius, Marcus heard something that made him question his sanity. Knocking. Not the crack of ice or the groan of metal, but deliberate, rhythmic knocking on the station's outer door. He grabbed the fire axe from the emergency kit, the only weapon he had, and approached the entrance slowly. His mind raced through possibilities. A polar bear? They didn't knock. Another person? Impossible. The nearest outpost was days away, and no one knew he was still alive. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. The knocking came again. 3 sharp raps. Marcus unlocked the outer door and pushed it open against the wind. Snow blasted into his face, blinding him. He raised the axe, ready to swing at whatever nightmare the Arctic had sent his way. Instead, he found a woman. She was small, wrapped in fur and canvas, her face hidden behind a scarf thick with ice. She stumbled past him into the airlock without a word, and he slammed the door shut behind her. The stranger's warning. Her name was Naya. She was Inuit, from a settlement Marcus didn't know existed, and she spoke English with an accent that suggested she'd learned it from old textbooks and shortwave radio broadcasts. "Your station is dying," she said flatly, once she'd removed her outer layers and sat by the bioreactor tank, soaking in its warmth. "The ice will break within 3 days. Maybe 2. Marcus stared at her. "How did you know I was here?" "We saw your helicopter leave 6 days ago, but we also saw smoke from your generator. When the smoke stopped yesterday, my grandfather sent me to see if anyone was still alive." She looked around the station, taking in the cobbled-together solar panels, the jury-rigged heating system, the bacterial tank humming softly in the corner. "You're smarter than the others. That's why they left you." "They left me because I knew too much." "Same thing," she said. Naya pulled a hand-drawn map from her pack, unfolding it on the lab table. It showed the coastline, the ice shelf, and a series of marks in red ink indicating fracture lines. "The mining company has been drilling south of here for 2 months. Seismic testing. They cracked the shelf in 17 places." She pointed to a mark disturbingly close to the station's location. "This section will break off completely. When it does, everything on it will sink or drift out to sea." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "You're saying they did this on purpose?" "I'm saying they didn't care if they did it or not." She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much for someone who couldn't be older than 25. "Your research. The bacteria. They want it buried. Literally. The choice that changed everything." Marcus had 2 options. He could leave with Naya, abandon the station and his research, and try to reach her settlement before the ice broke. It would mean survival, but it would also mean the end of everything he'd worked for. The bacteria samples would be lost. The data would sync with the station, and the mining company would win. Or he could stay, finish what he'd started, and find a way to preserve his research even if it meant going down with the station. There's a third option, Naya said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. You could move it. Marcus looked at her like she'd suggested flying to the moon. Move the station? It weighs tons. It's bolted to the ice. I don't have equipment, vehicles, or... You have me, she interrupted. And you have 6 hours before my grandfather expects me back. If we're going to save your work, we need to start now. Dismantling the impossible. They worked through the night with the desperate efficiency of people who knew exactly how little time they had. The station was modular by design, but it had never been intended for rapid disassembly in sub-zero temperatures by 2 people with minimal tools. Naya proved to be far more capable than Marcus had assumed. She knew ice, knew weight distribution, knew how to read the stress fractures spreading beneath their feet. While Marcus carefully packed his bacterial samples and research data into insulated containers, Naya began detaching wall panels and marking which support beams could be removed without collapsing the entire structure. We can't take everything, she said bluntly. We take the lab module, the bioreactor, and enough panels to build shelter. Everything else stays. The solar panels are heavy and fragile. We take 2, leave the rest. Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to insist they could save more, but another crack split the air, this one so loud it rattled his teeth. He looked down at the floor and saw a thin line of darkness spreading across the white surface, a fracture opening beneath them in real time. Now, Naya said, we move now. The sled they built from desperation. Using the station's emergency rescue sled as a base, they constructed a transport platform from stripped wall panels, cargo straps, and every piece of rope they could find. The bioreactor tank, still warm, still alive with bacteria, was secured at the center, surrounded by the lab equipment and sample containers. Marcus looked at their creation and saw exactly what it was, a desperate gamble held together with hope and duct tape. How are we supposed to pull this? He asked. Naya whistled. From somewhere beyond the edge of visibility, a sound answered, the huffing bark of sled dogs. 6 of them emerged from the storm, lean and powerful, their eyes reflecting the station's emergency lights like wild spirits. They were harnessed in traditional style, and they looked at Naya with the kind of trust that came from mutual survival. They're not strong enough for all this weight, Marcus said, doing rough calculations in his head. They're not pulling alone, Naya replied. She looked at him expectantly. You are. The first collapse. They'd traveled less than 2 kilometers when they heard it, a sound like thunder rolling up from beneath the earth. Marcus turned back toward the station and watched in horror as the remaining structure tilted, slowly at first, then faster, before disappearing into a sudden darkness that had opened in the ice. The entire shelf section where the station had stood was gone. Just gone. Swallowed by the Arctic Sea in less than 10 seconds. If they'd waited another hour, they would have gone with it. Naya kept moving, didn't even look back. Don't stop, she called over the wind. The fracture is still spreading. Marcus grabbed the pull rope and leaned into it with everything he had, his boots struggling for purchase on the ice. His legs burned, his lungs screamed, and his mind kept replaying that image, the station disappearing, taking with it the last 8 months of his life. Everything except what they carried on this sled. Everything except the research that someone had tried to bury. The question that broke him. Hours later, when they finally stopped to rest in the shelter of an ice ridge, Marcus collapsed onto the sled, gasping. His body had never hurt like this. He'd always been the academic, the lab scientist, the man who solved problems with his mind, not his back. Naya handed him a piece of dried meat and a thermos of tea so hot it burned his throat. Why are you helping me? He asked. You don't know me. You don't know if my research is worth this. She was quiet for a long time, looking out at the endless white. My grandfather says the earth is changing, warming, breaking. He says people like you, people who study these changes, are being silenced because the truth is expensive. She turned to face him. He says if we don't help people like you survive, soon there won't be anyone left who remembers how to live when everything breaks. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. How far to your settlement? He asked. 2 more days, she said. If the ice holds. They both looked down at the surface beneath them, knowing the same thing neither wanted to say aloud. The ice wasn't going to hold. They made it 37 hours before the world fell apart. Marcus woke to a sound that didn't belong in nature, a low, grinding moan that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the planet itself was groaning in pain. He scrambled out of the makeshift shelter they'd built from salvaged panels and saw Naya already standing, one hand raised in the universal signal for silence, her eyes scanning the horizon. "The shelf is breaking," she said quietly. The big break. Not just cracks anymore. In the pale morning light, Marcus could see what she meant. The ice around them had transformed overnight into a fractured mosaic of geometric patterns, some pieces the size of city blocks, others no larger than cars. And between them, thin lines of black water were spreading like veins of darkness through white skin. The sled, with its precious cargo of bacteria tanks and research equipment, sat on a piece of ice that was already separating from the main shelf. They had minutes, maybe less, before it became an island floating free in the Arctic Sea. "We have to jump it," Naya said, pointing to a gap roughly 2 meters wide that separated their section from a larger, more stable piece. "The dogs first, then the sled, then us." Marcus looked at the bioreactor tank, still generating its gentle warmth, still keeping the bacteria alive. 8 days ago, this had been an impossible theory. Now it was the only thing standing between him and freezing to death, and she wanted him to risk it all on a jump that might send everything crashing into freezing water. "If we lose the tank," he started. "If we don't jump, we lose everything anyway," Naya interrupted. "Choose." The leap that should have failed. They moved fast. Naya unharnessed the dogs and sent them across one at a time, each animal gathering itself and leaping the gap with practiced grace. Then came the hard part. The sled weighed over 200 kilograms, far too heavy for 2 people to lift. But Naya had grown up in a world where impossible was just another word for hasn't been done yet. She positioned Marcus on one side, herself on the other, and together they began rocking the sled back and forth, building momentum. "On 3, she called out. 1, 2, 3. They shoved with everything they had. The sled shot forward, hit the edge of the ice, and went airborne. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Marcus watched his entire life's work suspended in midair, the bacteria tank, the samples, the data drives, all of it hanging between survival and oblivion. The sled hit the other side with a crash that made Marcus's heart stop. It teetered on the edge, tilting backward toward the gap. One of the cargo straps snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Then the dogs, brilliant, loyal, impossible dogs, grabbed the harness lines with their teeth and pulled. The sled lurched forward onto solid ice and held. "Now us!" Naya yelled. They backed up as far as the shrinking ice would allow, then ran. Marcus felt his boots lose contact with the ground, felt the terrible emptiness of open air beneath him, felt the cold breath of Arctic water rising to meet him. His hands hit solid ice. He scrambled forward, chest burning, and collapsed next to the sled. Behind them, the section they'd been standing on tilted vertical and slipped beneath the surface without a sound, as if it had never existed at all. The settlement nobody believed existed. Naya's settlement wasn't on any map Marcus had ever seen. It existed in a fold of the coastline where ancient ice met volcanic rock, creating a microclimate that had sheltered her people for generations. 17 families lived there, in structures built partially underground, using geothermal heat from deep rock fissures to stay warm through the endless winter. They called it Kikiktak, the island that doesn't move. When Marcus stumbled into the settlement on the evening of the 9th day, half dead from exhaustion and frostbite, dragging a sled full of bacterial cultures and scientific equipment behind 6 exhausted dogs, the elders gathered to witness what they already knew would become a story told for generations. Naya's grandfather, a man named Amaric whose face looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the cliffs, studied Marcus for a long moment. Then he gestured toward a building dug into the hillside, its entrance marked by whale ribs arranged like cathedral arches. "Your fire water that lives," he said in careful English, nodding toward the bioreactor tank. "Bring it. We will see if your science and our knowledge can share the same house." What the bacteria taught the village. The building Amaric led them to was a communal workshop where traditional tools hung alongside salvaged equipment from shipwrecks and abandoned research stations. Marcus set up his bioreactor in the corner, connecting it to a system of stone channels that carried geothermal water through the space. For 3 days, he worked in silence, adjusting temperatures, monitoring bacterial growth, taking readings that either confirmed his theories or shattered them completely. The village children watched from doorways, whispering to each other in ineptitude, while the adults maintained a respectful distance but always watched. On the 4th day, something extraordinary happened. One of the elders, a woman named Pania who knew more about ice and survival than any university professor Marcus had ever met, approached his workspace carrying a clay pot filled with what looked like dark sludge. "From the seal hunting grounds," she explained, "where the ice meets the shore. It stinks. The young hunters say it's getting worse each year." She set the pot down near the bioreactor. "You're small creatures. Can they eat this?" Marcus analyzed the sample and felt his hands begin to shake. It was a mixture of microplastics, petroleum compounds, and organic decay. Exactly the kind of pollution his bacteria had evolved to consume. But this wasn't from ancient permafrost. This was fresh contamination, probably from industrial fishing operations or cargo ship ballast dumps. "I don't know," he admitted. "The bacteria I've been culturing are adapted to permafrost conditions. This is different chemistry, different temperature, different." Pania held up one hand. "Try," she said simply. "The ice is dying. The seals are confused. Our children will need to know how to heal what has been broken, or they will have nothing to hunt, nothing to eat." She looked at him with eyes that had watched the world change in ways no climate model could capture. "Your people broke it. Maybe your science can help fix it." The experiment that changed everything. Marcus introduced a sample of the contaminated sludge to a separate culture of his bacteria, carefully controlling temperature and nutrient levels. He expected the bacteria to die or go dormant. They'd evolved for permafrost conditions, not coastal pollution. Instead, something impossible happened. They adapted. Within 48 hours, the bacteria had begun metabolizing the petroleum compounds, breaking them down into simpler organic molecules and releasing heat in the process. Even more heat than they'd generated from the permafrost material. Marcus ran the tests 3 more times, certain he'd made a mistake. But the results held. The bacteria weren't just surviving in the polluted conditions, they were thriving. Millions of years of evolution had prepared them to break down complex organic molecules in extreme cold. The fact that some of those molecules were now synthetic pollutants instead of ancient plant matter didn't matter. The bacteria saw food, and they ate. "It's working," he told Pania, his voice cracking with exhaustion and wonder. "They're actually cleaning the contamination and generating enough heat to warm water in the process." She nodded as if she'd expected this all along. "Good. Now we build more." The village that became a laboratory. Over the next 3 months, Marcus's research station wasn't in some sterile laboratory funded by corporations. It was integrated into the daily life of Kikiktak. The villagers built 6 more bioreactor tanks, each one carefully monitored by community members who'd learned to read bacterial growth patterns with the same skill they'd once used to read ice conditions for hunting. The heated water from the tanks was channeled through the settlement's existing stone pipe system, providing warmth without burning fossil fuels. The cleaned water was tested, purified further through natural filtration methods Pania's people had used for generations, and returned to the environment. But more importantly, the young people of the village began to understand that science wasn't something that happened in distant universities by people who'd never seen real ice. It was a tool for survival, just like traditional knowledge, just like the skills their grandparents had passed down. Marcus taught them to maintain the cultures, to recognize signs of bacterial health or contamination, to adjust conditions for optimal growth. In return, they taught him things no textbook had ever contained. How to read weather patterns from the behavior of birds, how to identify safe ice from ice that was ready to shatter, how to survive when every modern convenience had failed. The message that reached the world. On a clear afternoon in early March, when the sun finally stayed above the horizon for more than a few hours, a supply plane landed on the ice runway near Kikiktak. The pilot was making his seasonal rounds to remote settlements, carrying mail, medicine, and news from the outside world. He also carried something else, a satellite communication device that Marcus used to send a compressed data package to 3 different universities, 2 environmental organizations, and 1 investigative journalist who'd built a career exposing corporate malfeasance. The package contained everything: his original research on permafrost bacteria, detailed documentation of the bioreactor system, water quality tests showing pollution reduction, thermal efficiency data, and most importantly, a complete record of the mining company's seismic testing, the deliberate fracturing of the ice shelf, and the attempted suppression of his research. "They tried to bury me," Marcus wrote in the accompanying message. "They failed. This research belongs to everyone now. Use it." Within a week, the story had spread across scientific networks and news media. Within a month, 3 independent research teams had requested permission to visit Kikiktak. Within 3 months, the mining company faced criminal investigations in 2 countries. The man who came back to gloat. Dr. Peterson arrived in late April, helicoptered in with a legal team and a public relations specialist who kept trying to take photographs until Amara quietly suggested he put the camera away or lose it to the ocean. Peterson looked older than Marcus remembered, grayer, with the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting battles you knew you'd already lost. "You should have died," he said without preamble, standing in the doorway of the workshop where Marcus was training 2 village teenagers to maintain bacterial cultures. "The ice broke. The station sank. You had no food, no heat, no way out. You should have died." Marcus looked up from his work. "I had something better than what you took. I had a reason to survive. That bacteria could have been worth billions." "It is worth billions," Marcus interrupted. "Just not to you. It's worth billions of liters of cleaned water, billions of tons of reduced pollution, billions of people who might actually have a chance if we can scale this technology fast enough." He gestured toward the teenagers, who watched the confrontation with curious eyes. "These kids understand that. Why don't you?" Peterson opened his mouth, then closed it again. The fight seemed to drain out of him all at once. "The company is finished," he said quietly. "Criminal charges. Civil suits. We're done." "Good," Marcus said without sympathy. "Maybe you'll have time to remember why you became a scientist in the first place. The winter that proved everything." The second winter at Kikiktak was different from the first. This time, Marcus wasn't fighting for survival. He was building something permanent. The bioreactor system had expanded to 13 tanks, serving not just the village, but 2 neighboring settlements that had heard about the bacteria that ate poison and made warmth. International researchers came and went, respectful visitors who learned quickly that this wasn't a laboratory they were touring. It was a home, and the people who lived there weren't research subjects but collaborators with knowledge that went back hundreds of generations. On the longest night of winter, Amara called a gathering in the communal hall. The entire village attended, plus Marcus, plus 3 visiting researchers from a Norwegian environmental institute. "My grandfather's grandfather," Amarik began, speaking in Inuktitut while Naya translated, told stories of a time when the ice spoke to those who listened, when the world was balanced, when taking from the earth was matched by giving back. He looked at Marcus. "You came here dying, chased by men who valued profit over truth. You brought knowledge from the old ice, from creatures older than our stories. And you listened when we shared what we knew." He pulled out a carved piece of bone, marked with symbols Marcus had learned represented protection and continuation. "This is for you. Not because you saved yourself, but because you chose to share what you learned. Because you understood that survival isn't about one person, one discovery, one victory. It's about all of us learning to live in the world as it actually is, not as we wish it to be." Marcus accepted the gift with hands that still bore scars from frostbite, from hauling sleds across breaking ice, from the desperate work of staying alive when everything said he should die. The legacy no one expected. 5 years later, bacterial bioreactor systems based on Marcus's research operated in 47 locations across the Arctic, subarctic, and northern temperate zones. They'd been adapted for different climates, different pollution types, different community needs. Some warmed buildings. Some cleaned industrial waste. Some did both. The technology wasn't patented. Marcus had refused every corporate offer, every government contract that came with intellectual property clauses. Instead, he'd placed everything in the public domain, with one condition: Any community or organization using the technology had to teach it to others freely. Science doesn't belong to scientists, he told a packed auditorium at a climate conference where he'd been invited to speak. It belongs to everyone who needs it to survive. I learned that from people who never went to university, who couldn't have told you what bacteria were called, but who understood something more important. That knowledge hoarded is knowledge wasted. In the audience, Naya sat with her daughter, a little girl named Pania after her great-grandmother, who already knew how to read ice and maintain bacterial cultures with equal skill. The wall that never got built. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Marcus would stand at the edge of Kikiktak and look out at the ice. It was still breaking, still fracturing, still changing. The climate crisis hadn't been solved by bacteria any more than it could be solved by any single technology. But there were places now where the breaking had slowed, where pollution was being cleaned, where communities had tools to adapt, to survive, to fight back against the forces trying to bury them, literally or figuratively. The mining company that had abandoned him? Dissolved in bankruptcy. Dr. Peterson? Teaching environmental science at a small college, using Marcus's research as a cautionary tale about corporate influence in research. And Marcus himself? He split his time between Kikiktak and a small research institute that operated on donations and grants from environmental foundations. He published papers, trained students, and testified at regulatory hearings. But mostly, he taught people to listen. To the ice, to the bacteria, to the elders who'd been warning about climate change since before it was called climate change. Because he'd learned something in those desperate days hauling a sled across fracturing ice. The world didn't need heroes. It needed people stubborn enough to survive, smart enough to adapt, and humble enough to learn from anyone who had knowledge worth sharing. The final truth. On the 10th anniversary of the day he'd watched his colleagues fly away and leave him to die, Marcus received a letter from one of the teenagers he'd taught in Kikiktak. She was in university now, studying environmental microbiology, working on her own research about extremophile organisms. "You taught me," she wrote, "that the most powerful act of resistance is refusing to die when powerful people want you gone. That survival itself is a form of defiance. That knowledge shared is stronger than knowledge hoarded. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for trusting us with your work. Thank you for understanding that science is just another form of survival. And survival is something my people have always known how to do." Marcus folded the letter and placed it in his journal. The same journal he'd hidden from Peterson, the same journal he'd dragged across breaking ice, the same journal that had taught him how to survive. They'd tried to bury him in the Arctic ice. They'd failed. And in failing, they'd created something they couldn't control. A scientist who understood that the most dangerous thing you can do to someone isn't trying to kill them. It's giving them a reason to survive. And then underestimating what they'll build with that survival once they're free.